Thank you very much, Kemi. Thank you to Jill. She's left me a few things to finish off. We need to think a bit more about the Greeks. We need to think a bit more about Francis of Assisi. So we'll try and cover all those things. But first, I want to say that we're starting a new series. The Invited series has finished for us now, and we're on to a small series on the book of Philippians, looking especially at what we can learn about teamwork. That's working together. Jill's picture of the family and the need to work together is perfect, really, but just on a bigger scale as far as the church is concerned. So teamwork from the book of Philippians. And we've had a reading from Philippians, probably the most well-known passage from it, and I'll say a few things about that. But essentially, I'm just here to introduce the series. It's me and then 4 other people, including Reverend Rachel next Sunday, looking at different aspects of teamwork from Philippians. So I'm really quite looking forward to this. Now, you may or may not know the letter to the Philippians, which was written by the Apostle Paul to some early Christians who lived in the city of Philippi. He knew the situation there quite well because he was the one who founded the church there. But he's writing about 10 years later, give or take, we don't quite know, to the what's happened to the church there. Basically, how has it developed and grown and things like that. So the situation is a little bit different. You might say that the book of the letter of Philippians is a happy sort of a letter. Remember those words, rejoice in the Lord always. That's that sort of thing. And it is basically a happy letter, and it's popular amongst Christians, but there are, I'm going to call them darker undercurrents to it, which don't occupy a lot of words, but they could have been really significant. You know, the most obvious one is to do with the Apostle Paul, that he is writing from prison. He is in chains. Although he hopes he's going to be set free, it's not perfectly clear to him at this point. So that's a dark undercurrent as far as Paul is concerned. The most obvious dark undercurrent as far as the church is concerned is that there seems to have been a squabble of some sort. We don't know really the background to it amongst 2 prominent members of the church. And I'm going to make some speculation about that in a little while. So you could say, just like all churches, church in Philippi has some messiness to it, as well as some good points. So the messiness will be to do with the conflicts there. And the good points, for example, was their generosity and what they shared in common with the Apostle Paul, because they had just sent to him a gift. So messiness and some successes, we can say. A church is always a little bit like that. Our church will be like that as well. I quite like the Joe Biden tweet, which he put out in the midst of a difficult situation in America in November, using the word messy. So here it is, just in case it slipped your memory. Democracy is sometimes messy. So sometimes it requires a little patience. Democracy is sometimes messy, so sometimes it requires a little patience. And that's what's needed, you know, in a church in Philippi, in a church like ours. You'll remember, and has been mentioned today, that we used to have this title, Church in Progress. That's exactly what a church is. You know, we are developing, basically. We are identifying weaknesses and difficulties and inconsistencies, and hopefully we're able to still bring out good things and improve. Let's think about the conflict and that aspect of the messiness in Philippi. We don't really know what's going on there. It could just be that 2 people don't get on with one another. We could say that they rub one another up the wrong way. I think we all know what that's a little bit like, where it's just very difficult to make decent friends and have good relationships with some people. It could be down to those personality differences, or it could be a little bit down to an aspect of Greek culture and values which would still have been influential and is still influential basically through the many cultures of the world, where people jockey for the pole position. Amongst the Greeks, there was a very famous couple of words, which we will look at, where people wanted to achieve honor. This is personal or individual honor and glory. Does that sound attractive to you? And mostly this was achieved through heroism on the battlefield. But other ways it could be. Good speech making could enhance somebody's honor and their reputation. But the word honor and glory was big for them. And so, you know, a while later, not to be surprised if people wanted to achieve the pole position in terms of honor and influence in the Greco-Roman cities. And while, you know, originally it was done on the battlefield, later on it was done through political maneuvering as people jockeyed for position in the city. Now, what would happen then if those kind of dynamics which took place in the city political realm took place in the church? If there were several people then jockeying for the honor, the prestige of being the most influential, the most important person in the life of a church. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. And indeed, I think it is. And I'm going to say that the bit of what we've read from Philippians chapter 2 may very well as what was behind possibly the disagreement between the two prominent members of the church, may well have its background in terms of this jockeying for position and for power. It was just common in its own day. Now, you might think, therefore, that when we've read Philippians chapter 2 and you're saying to yourself, well, it doesn't sound as though this big concept of personal honor and glory are thought about. You say, there's no connection. This is not the sort of language which the New Testament would be using, but in fact, it does to some degree with some amendment. And so we're going to look at some of the occasions where the words honor and glory are used in the New Testament letters very close to one another. And sometimes you'll see that these relate to people. Sometimes they will relate to God. So if we can put up the first of these, I'll simply read them to you. And if you're very interested in it, you could write down the verse numbers and have a little look at the background to them. I'm simply going to read them just one after the other. So Romans 2:7 says, those who by persistence in doing good seek glory, honor, and immortality, he will give eternal life. Next slide. Romans 2:10, but glory, honor, and peace for everyone who does good, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. Next slide. 1 Timothy 1:17, now to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God, be honor and glory forever and ever. Amen. Hebrews 2:7, you made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor. Hebrews 2:9, but we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor, because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. 1 Peter 1:7. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. 2 Peter 1:17. He received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory, saying, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am pleased. that's the end of that series. So thank you for the slides. What we see there is that this old concept of honor and glory hasn't been ejected from the New Testament. It still is there, but actually it is understood in a new way. And it raises the question, not so much as to whether honor and glory are good things, but actually what honor and glory really look like in somebody's life. So I'll try and do this by looking at the matter of Francis of Assisi and his two dreams. He was there in the early 13th century Italy, so don't worry if it sounds a little bit unusual to you, in the same way as perhaps the Greek dream of honor and glory might, especially by military conquest, might sound a bit unusual to you. This is all historical. But there are two dreams, and I'm keen to say this because the first dream was overridden by the second dream, and the second dream led him into something greater than the first dream. Now, we quite often use the word dreams as to, personal ambitions, the desires of our hearts, the things which we really want to be and to accomplish. And I think St. Francis is not a bad person because he was somewhat a dreamer. He was somewhat an idealist. And I'm going to tell you about the first dream and the run up to that first of all. Ever before he was a saint, St. Francis was relatively wealthy. He loved life, had great friends, but his first dream, I would say, is to be a would-be knight, a soldier, and he would want to do this and be successful as a knight, to be a good knight, as understood back in those days. So the first dream was that he saw the house in which he was living. It's quite a rich place where his father sold cloths. And he saw it no longer in that sense. He saw it not as a shop and a house, but rather as a palace. And on the wall, there would have been banners, and there would have been shields. And somewhere else in the house, there would have been a maiden, a beautiful maiden for him to champion. And what he understood by this is that when he became a knight, he would accomplish all of those things, all the wealth and the honor and the increase of his personal status would come through him being a soldier. So he was going to go on his second outing, his second adventure as a soldier. The first one hadn't been very successful, but that's another matter. And soon after he set out from Assisi, and he spent the night in a place called Spoleto. He went there with his 2 horses and his squire, because he was a would-be knight, and he had his second dream. And this time he heard the words, "Why do you burden yourself seeking the servant instead of the master?" I'll say that again. Why do you burden yourself seeking the servant instead of the master? Go home, where it shall be told you what to do. So this could have been really embarrassing, but he took those words to heart and he went back. He didn't go to join up with the rest of the army. He went back to Assisi, but in a sense, he was a changed person because he had lost interest in what he had found pleasure in before. And he began to avoid the sports and the feasts of his former companions. He began to see that his own destiny, his own dream, lay not in being a knight, but actually it was to follow in the way of poverty. And this is a complete and utter U-turn. It would have been almost incomprehensible to people in his own town and all the rest of it. He changed dramatically. And to explain it, I think he would have said that he fell in love. he fell in love with the lady Poverty, and he gave his life to her service. So these are violently opposing dreams, one for personal glory and wealth, and the other one is the life of humility in love with poverty. So I think he was a definite idealist, and there were two different idealisms or two different dreams here. But in the end, the second, the love of poverty and its service, became the primary direction of his life. We could understand the two things in this way as well. We see how the first dream of greatness would have fed on his ego, on his sense of personal greatness. And the second one was all about his personal humility. So the ideal of chivalry became his ideal of poverty. And I think the second dream, because it was so unusual, so very much to do with him as a person, it wasn't borrowed from anybody else. It wasn't derived from society. We've talked about that in the church in Philippi, as people sort of copied one another and wanted to become the great one in the city. This was really personal, I think, for Saint Francis. It was more personal to him. It was more creative. It was more different. He, in a sense, in his second dream and following it through, began to tread new ground. And he did it by embracing the very thing that most people sought to avoid. So it led to his humble service to leprosy sufferers. There's famous stories about how he would embrace them and wash them. Rather than have a victory over others in battle, he rebuilt a ruined church rather than built a palace for himself to live in. Well, let's go back, because the word dream is so common that people have or have had. You know, maybe these things have slipped away a little bit, but there may well have been a time, or there is a time, when you have dreams for yourself. This story of St. Francis probably tells me that dreams can be changed. You can grow and develop and have a new understanding of the direction in which you are going in. And then what kind of dream is it? In the end, I think that Francis chose, even though it was so unusual, for him the greater dream, this service in poverty. So for him, I think it was the greater path that he went on, because it captivated his heart. So if you've got a dream, the next question is, by what means will you pursue it? And we have the military conquest ideal, but then we have the humble service ideal of St. Francis. In Philippians, we see an answer to this, that it is okay, in a sense, to follow the way of honor and glory, but it doesn't mean by humiliating or defeating others. It actually means by humbling yourself before others. Here's a verse from Philippians chapter 3 and verse number 3. Do nothing out of selfish ambition, and I'll come back to that word in a minute, or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. This again is just very difficult. It's difficult for me, and I guess for most people, to really absorb as a way of living. Do nothing out of selfish ambition. Now I'm going to read to you from my little book about selfish ambition, because there's something lurking here which I think is worth knowing. So this is a bit to do with the Greek language, and it's to do with the word for selfish ambition. It says in my book, it particularly denoted a self-seeking pursuit of political office by unfair means. It came to be used of the jockeying for position and the intriguing for place and power. Finally, it meant selfish ambition, the ambition which has no conception of service and whose only aims are profit and power. This to me is an astonishing word, really. And it simply just highlights the fact that in the political systems in Greece, and you might say, well, ever since then, there has been this jockeying for power. But actually, this is a motivation which the Apostle Paul is saying cannot exist in the church. It should not be there. So he says there, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Such a great concept of selfless service, and so very difficult to accomplish. It ran against the grain of what was commonly done in society. But Paul is saying the churches must be different from how you necessarily see some things going on in society. A bit like St. Francis, we are less here to copy what is going on outside and more here to follow the example of Christ in how we conduct ourselves. So just to finish off then about the team, as we are, many of us, members of teams, the foundation we see here is that being in a team is based on the humility of Christ, rather than seeing it as an opportunity for self-advancement. Christ is our model. This is what it says in chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. He made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So in whatever teams you are in, let's just name a few in a church. How about the Sunday school or similar? How about the elders or deacons or those who cook food in a kitchen or serve refreshments after a service in normal times, or in family life or in work? Being members of a team modeled on the humility of Christ. So how does the humility of Christ affect us as we are in teams? How does it guide your contribution? The answer I would suggest is that we will serve our team and its aims. We will serve our team and its aims. That's what I think that the humility here is about. It's about serving.